When people think about the fall of Rome, they picture chaos, barbarian invasions, burning cities, an empire overwhelmed by enemies at the gates. It's a powerful image, and it's also misleading, because invasions explain how Rome ended, not why it collapsed. By the time the first barbarian armies crossed Roman borders, the empire was already fragile, not militarily, not politically, but financially. Rome didn't fall when enemies arrived. It fell long before, quietly, internally, and almost invisibly. At its height, the Roman Empire looked unstoppable. It controlled territory across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its roads connected continents. Its laws outlived centuries. Rome had professional armies, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and one of the most advanced economies the ancient world had ever seen. From the outside, it looked permanent. But history teaches a dangerous lesson. Empires don't collapse when they appear weak. They collapse when they appear strongest, because that's when their systems are under the most strain. Rome's power wasn't free. It came with costs that grew larger every year. An empire of Rome's size required something unprecedented: a permanent professional military. Soldiers needed regular pay. Veterans expected land and pensions. Borders demanded constant defense. As Rome expanded, those costs never went away. They compounded. At first, taxes covered the expense, but over time, taxation reached its limits. The empire had conquered almost everything it could. There were no new lands left to absorb the pressure. What began as temporary military spending became permanent financial obligation, and that is where Rome's real problem began. Because when an empire can no longer pay for its power honestly, it starts paying for it creatively. At first, Rome didn't do anything unusual. When expenses rose, the empire borrowed. Borrowing felt safe, temporary, invisible. As long as the future could pay the bill, nothing seemed wrong. But Rome's future was already fully committed. Taxes were high. Expansion had slowed. The economy could no longer absorb new pressure. So the empire searched for a solution that didn't look like failure. It changed the money. Roman coins had once been valuable because of what they contained. Silver gave them weight. Trust gave them circulation. Over time, that balance shifted. The empire reduced the silver content of its coins. The coin looked the same, carried the same stamp, was accepted as payment, but it no longer held the same value. This allowed Rome to mint more money without creating more wealth. On the surface, it solved the problem. Underneath, it rewired behavior. Imagine being a Roman soldier. Your pay arrives on time, but each year, it buys less food, less equipment, less security for your family. So you ask for higher pay. The empire agrees by issuing even more weakened coins. Merchants notice next. They raise prices not out of greed, but out of survival. Citizens adapt quietly. They spend money faster. They save harder assets. They distrust the currency. This is the moment systems begin to fail, not through collapse, but through behavior. People stop believing the money will hold its value. And when belief disappears, money still circulates, but it no longer stabilizes anything. Rome didn't debase its currency because it was careless. It did it because the empire had become too expensive to sustain honestly. Debt didn't just finance the system, it became the system. And once that happens, collapse becomes a matter of time. Once Rome's money began to weaken, the effects didn't stay isolated. They moved outward, from markets to armies to everyday life. Inflation wasn't announced, it was felt. Prices rose slowly at first. Bread cost a little more, tools cost a little more, transport cost a little more. Nothing dramatic, but wages didn't keep up. So people adjusted. They demanded higher pay. They raised prices. They stopped trusting contracts that were fixed in money. This is how inflation feeds itself. Not through panic, but through rational behavior. Merchants shortened credit, trade slowed, long-distance commerce became risky. An economy built on trust began to fragment. The army felt it next. Soldiers demanded more pay. The state responded by minting more debased coins, which weakened the currency even further. This created a loop Rome couldn't escape. More spending led to weaker money. Weaker money led to higher costs. Higher costs demanded more spending. Each solution made the next problem worse. To compensate, the empire increased taxes. Landowners were squeezed. Small farmers struggled. Many abandoned their land altogether. What looked like economic adjustment began to look like social decay. People didn't lose faith in Rome overnight. They lost faith piece by piece. In the currency, in the system, and eventually in the future itself. By the time Rome faced its external enemies, its internal foundation was already compromised. The collapse wasn't loud, it was cumulative. When the invasions finally came, they didn't arrive as a surprise. Rome had faced external threats for centuries. What had changed wasn't the enemies. It was Rome's ability to respond. An empire that once defended vast borders with discipline now struggled to maintain them. Not because it lacked soldiers, but because it lacked cohesion. Pay was unreliable. Supplies were inconsistent. Loyalty became conditional. Armies that once defended the state now negotiated with it. Some borders were protected. Others were simply abandoned. Defensive systems didn't collapse all at once. They thinned. And when pressure increased, there was no margin left. This is why invasions appeared decisive. They arrived after the system had already weakened. External forces don't destroy strong systems, they expose weak ones. Rome wasn't defeated in a single moment. It was revealed. By the time outsiders crossed its borders, the empire no longer had the financial strength to hold itself together. The invasions didn't cause the collapse, they confirmed it. One of the strangest things about collapse is how sudden it feels. Years of decay pass quietly, then everything seems to fall apart at once. But collapse is never sudden to the system, it only feels sudden to the people living inside it. This happens because humans adapt. When prices rise slowly, people adjust. When money weakens gradually, people compensate. They normalize the decline. Each year becomes the new baseline. What once felt unacceptable becomes routine. This is how warning signs disappear. No single change feels catastrophic until the system reaches a limit. At that point, adaptation stops working. The margin is gone. Trade breaks. Supply chains fail. Institutions lose credibility. And what took decades to weaken appears to collapse overnight. Rome's citizens didn't wake up one day to a collapsing empire. They woke up to conditions they had already learned to live with, until one day those conditions stopped being livable. This is why history always looks obvious in hindsight and invisible in real time. Collapse doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself. The reason Rome still matters is not because it was unique. It matters because its incentives were ordinary. Large systems behave the same way when faced with the same pressures. They borrow to preserve stability. They adjust the currency to delay consequences. They trade long-term trust for short-term relief. And they do it quietly. These choices don't feel reckless in the moment. They feel responsible. They keep systems running. They avoid immediate pain until the cost accumulates. What Rome shows us is not a timeline, but a pattern. When money is weakened to protect power, power becomes dependent on money never failing. That dependency grows slowly, then all at once. History doesn't repeat itself because people forget it. It repeats because systems reward the same choices. Rome is not a warning about the past. It is a mirror for any system that believes it can outrun its own incentives. Rome didn't collapse in a moment. It unraveled over time, not because it was invaded, but because it could no longer sustain itself honestly. Debt replaced discipline, debasement replaced restraint, and trust eroded quietly year after year. By the time the world noticed Rome's fall, the collapse had already happened. What followed was not chaos, it was confirmation. History remembers the moment empires fall, but collapse begins long before the moment is visible. Rome didn't fall to barbarians, it fell to money, and history has been repeating that lesson ever since.